I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd heard the stories, seen the movies, but I always thought there was a rational explanation for everything. That changed the night we moved into 463 Elm Street. It was the house of our dreams, a grand Victorian with polished wood floors, high ceilings, and stained glass windows that cast a warm glow across the rooms when the sun hit just right. Mary was in love with the place from the moment she stepped inside. And I was just happy to finally have a home where we could watch Emily and Ethan grow up. It was perfect. Too perfect. The first few nights were blissfully uneventful. Moving boxes, unpacking, the usual. But by the end of the first week, something started to shift. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things at first. A strange draft in the hallway, despite all the windows being closed. The feeling that you weren't alone, even when you were the only one in the room. Mary brushed it off as new house jitters. I tried to, too. But then Emily started waking up in the middle of the night, her eyes wide, staring at something I couldn't see. "Daddy," she whispered one night, "there's a man by the window." I flipped on the light, expecting to see nothing but shadows. But I wasn't prepared for what I saw. A figure, barely there, standing at the foot of her bed. His eyes, hollow and sad, locked with mine for a split second before he faded away like smoke. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I told myself it was a trick of the light, exhaustion playing with my mind. But things only got worse. Ethan, our youngest, had always had a wild imagination, but his new friend in the walls gave me the creeps. At first it seemed like innocent child's play. He'd laugh and whisper, talking to this imaginary person. But soon, his giggles turned to unsettling conversations. "The man in the walls says this is his house," Ethan said one evening, his voice too calm for my liking. I couldn't shake the cold that crept up my spine every time I heard him say that. The house felt different after that. Darker. The air was thick, heavy, like the walls themselves were watching, waiting. Objects moved when no one was looking. A chair would be in a different spot than we'd left it. Doors that had been shut were suddenly open. I didn't say anything to Mary at first. I didn't want to scare her. But she knew. She could feel it too. The worst part was the cold. It would hit suddenly, like a wave, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. It wasn't the kind of cold you can shake off. It felt personal, almost like it was alive. One night, I woke to the sound of my name. It was soft, almost like a whisper in the wind, but clear enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I opened my eyes, and there it was, the figure I had seen in Emily's room. Only this time he was closer. His eyes burned with a cold, unnatural light, and his mouth twisted into something resembling a smile. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, and I felt his cold hand pass through my chest. The sensation was unbearable, like ice and fire at the same time, freezing my lungs and scorching my heart. I gasped for breath, but it felt like the house itself was trying to suffocate me. When I finally broke free, I stumbled out of bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. That was the last straw. I knew then that we couldn't stay. The house didn't want us here. It never did. I tried to tell Mary, but I didn't have to. She'd seen it too, in her own way. The constant chill, the shadows that flickered just out of sight, the whispers. We packed what we could that night, throwing clothes into bags, not caring about what we left behind. As we loaded the kids into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. It stood there, silent, waiting. The windows seemed to watch us leave, and for a moment I swore I saw a figure in one of them, a man, his sad eyes fixed on me, as if daring me to come back. We never returned to 463 Elm Street. I never told anyone the full story, not even the real estate agents who called weeks later, asking why we left in such a hurry. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Who would? But every now and then, when the house pops up in conversation, I hear things. People say it's been abandoned for years, that no one's been able to stay there for long. There are rumors, stories of flickering lights, of children's laughter echoing through the empty halls, of a man with sad eyes standing at the windows, watching. I know what I saw. I know what we lived through. And I'll never forget the feeling of that cold, burning touch. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it didn't want to let us go. I still remember that night in Crestwood. Halloween had always been a big deal there. People spent months planning costumes, decorating their homes, and waiting for the annual Halloween party. But that year was different. The air was thick with something far more menacing than fog. There was a chill, not just in the breeze, but in the way the shadows seemed to cling to the ground. I wasn't sure if I imagined it, but from the moment I stepped into Mark's house, something felt off. The party itself was just like every other year, loud music, laughter, and the overwhelming smell of pumpkin spice. The house was decked out to the nines with cobwebs, jack-o'-lanterns, and skeletons. People mingled in their costumes, drinks in hand, and the energy was high. But as the night wore on, that energy shifted. I first noticed it when I went to check my phone. A text I had sent earlier to my friend James hadn't been answered. At first I brushed it off. He was probably just caught up in the fun. But when I tried calling, it went straight to voicemail. I looked around for him but couldn't spot his ridiculous pirate costume anywhere. "Hey, have you seen James?" I asked a girl dressed as a vampire, hoping she might have seen him. She shrugged. "Not for a while. Maybe he went to get more drinks." I nodded, but something gnawed at me. As the minutes passed, more people started noticing that friends had gone missing. At first it was just a few, but then more and more faces disappeared from the crowd. It was subtle. One moment they were dancing or laughing, and the next, they were simply gone. It was all fun and games at first. Everyone thought it was part of the Halloween atmosphere, maybe a prank someone was pulling. But the laughter turned uneasy, and the once vibrant room began to feel claustrophobic. The music died down, leaving only the sound of nervous whispers. Mark, the host, climbed onto a chair, his face pale under the dim light. "All right, everyone. Stay calm," he said, his voice shaking just slightly. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation for all of this." He wasn't fooling anyone. The tension was rising. People began checking their phones, trying to call their friends. Most calls went unanswered. Then, the lights flickered. When they came back on, the front door creaked open. I remember the way my heart pounded in my chest as I saw them. The missing guests, James among them, were walking back inside. But something was wrong. Horribly wrong. James wasn't the same. None of them were. Their costumes were soaked in what looked like real blood. At first I thought it was some elaborate trick, but then I saw their faces. Their expressions were hollow, vacant. It was as if they had seen something beyond this world, something that had broken them. "James," I whispered, stepping toward him, but he didn't respond. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. His eyes, once full of life, were now glassy and dead. The others who had disappeared began to surround the room, their slow mechanical movements eerily synchronized. Panic spread through the remaining partygoers. People screamed, trying to push past each other to the exit, but the doors slammed shut on their own. The air grew thick, oppressive. I couldn't breathe. In the chaos, Mark tried to reason with them, pleading with his friends. But they weren't listening. Whatever had taken them wasn't letting them go. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into near darkness. I could hear the shuffle of feet, the strained gasps of people trying to escape. But there was no escape. I crouched low, hiding behind a sofa, watching in horror as the once lively party turned into a scene from a nightmare. Those who had reappeared began to lunge at the remaining guests, their hands stained with blood, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart raced, and I bolted for the back door, shoving past overturned tables and decorations. But no matter how fast I ran, the house seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in, the air colder with each step. Finally, I burst through the door and into the night, but the silence outside was deafening. The fog that had once hovered ominously now seemed to suffocate the town. I turned to look back at the house, but it was as if it had vanished, swallowed by the darkness. There was no trace of the party, no sound of the nightmare unfolding inside. The authorities didn't believe me when I told them what had happened. They never found the house, nor did they find any of the guests. Crestwood had its share of urban legends, but that night became something more. It became a whispered story, passed around like a campfire tale, a grim reminder of the night when the annual Halloween party took a sinister turn. I still see James sometimes, in my dreams, in the shadows. His eyes, empty and cold, staring back at me. I know he's waiting for me, just like the others, waiting for me to return to the party that never ended. It was Halloween night when I, along with my friends, decided to brave the legend of Cranbrook Mental Asylum. The asylum, a decaying monstrosity on the outskirts of Blackwood, had always been a source of local lore. Stories of ghostly apparitions and strange occurrences circulating like whispers on the wind. It had once been a beacon of hope, but now it stood as a crumbling monument to despair. We approached the main gate, its rusted iron bars twisted with age. A cold wind howled through the night, carrying the faint, mournful cries of the past. Each step we took seemed to draw the cold closer, and though our breaths came out in visible puffs, we pressed on. The gate groaned in protest as we pushed it open, and the sound echoed ominously through the deserted grounds. Inside, the asylum loomed like a giant skeleton against the night sky. Peeling paint and broken windows told tales of neglect, and the air was thick with the stench of mold and decay. Every breath felt like inhaling a piece of the place's sorrow. The silence inside was almost deafening, broken only by the echo of our footsteps, which seemed unnervingly loud in the vast emptiness. We ventured deeper into the asylum, exploring rooms that had once held hope, but were now testaments to suffering. Rusted medical equipment and scattered charts told of treatments gone wrong, and the restraints on the beds were stark reminders of the harsh realities faced by past patients. The deeper we went, the colder it became. Shadows danced just out of our sight, and every groan of the building made our hearts pound. We found ourselves in the hydrotherapy room, once a place of healing now filled with rusted tubs and broken chairs. The equipment seemed to hold the echoes of anguish, and a cold wind swept through, making the room feel alive with a sinister presence. Sarah, one of the braver members of our group, gasped and stumbled back. Her face was ashen, eyes wide with terror. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The rest of us nodded, feeling it too, a ghostly touch that seemed to pass through us, leaving a chill that settled deep in our bones. We pressed on, our unease growing with each step. The atmosphere grew heavier as we reached the solitary confinement wing. The cells were small and oppressive, designed to isolate the most troubled souls. The walls seemed to close in around us, and our breaths came out in shaky puffs as we moved through the narrow corridors. Then we saw it, scratched into the wall in frantic letters, "Beware the screaming man." The words seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy, sending shivers down our spines. It felt like the walls themselves were warning us of an impending danger. Just as we were about to turn back, the scream came. It was a blood-curdling, ear-splitting wail that seemed to emanate from every corner of the building at once. It pierced through our very souls, filling the asylum with an almost tangible dread. We froze, our hearts racing as the sound reverberated through the halls. In sheer terror, we bolted. Our footsteps pounded through the empty corridors, the screaming echoing behind us. We didn't stop until we burst through the asylum gates, the cold night air hitting us like a tidal wave. We stood there, gasping for breath, staring back at the asylum with a mix of relief and lingering fear. None of us ever returned. The experience haunted us, each of us grappling with the memory of the screaming man. Cranbrook Asylum remained a chilling reminder of the horrors that once lurked within its walls, a legend that would never truly fade.